that would allow us to identify you. Okay, so if I think about this morning's agenda, I'm going to give a very few brief introductory remarks, and then I'm going to hand over to Abhilasha Fullonton, who is a research associate at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research within the School of Engineering at the University of Manchester, and she will be presenting the findings of the work. We'll then open it up to questions and answers. And Abhilasha will be joined by colleagues who I will introduce a little bit later on. And then we will finish with a few closing remarks from AAF. We don't anticipate this going on longer than 1 hour, so we're aiming for a very prompt finish at 11 a.m. UK time. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now and ask Abhilasha to introduce or to load up her presentation. While she's doing that, just a few words of introduction about why AAF asked for this work to be undertaken. We have, I suppose, all like everyone in the sector and governments, both internationally and nationally, been thinking about the effort that's going to be required to decarbonize this sector, the challenges and obstacles that exist for most of the pathways that are going to get us there. And therefore, we were interested to make sure that we don't ignore potential pathways or close the conversation down too early. We're trying to sort of see what the broad range of possible measures and approaches that there are to decarbonising the sector. And whilst in terms of sort of alternatives to kerosene and SAF have focused very much around hydrogen and electric, we were aware that there have been conversations around ammonia as well. And so we thought it was an opportune moment to explore what the potential could be for ammonia. And so we asked the Tyndall Centre at the University of Manchester whether they could look into this topic. And I'm really pleased that the author, Abhilasha Fullonton, is going to present those findings to you now. Just by way of introduction, Abhilasha is a research associate at the Tyndall Centre. He's currently working on a UK Energy Research Centre project exploring the barriers and opportunities of sustainable fuels in the freight and aviation sectors. And before joining Tyndall, Abhilasha was a senior analyst at a sustainability consulting firm where she tracked legislation, demand and supply of carbon allowances and assessed the effectiveness of carbon markets in India and North America. And she's previously worked for the United Nations and for the World Watch Institute. So that said, Abhilasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, so like Tim mentioned, I'm based here at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester. We are a group of climate change researchers who are doing interdisciplinary research on various topics, looking at climate mitigation and adaptation. It's the right. I'm assuming everybody can see my slides. Perfect. Right. So just to kind of give sort of a quick introductory background to the project, AEF and Tyndall kind of ventured on this plan, as Tim mentioned, to write a report in examining ammonia's viability as a potential aviation fuel. And if not its viability as a fuel itself, what role it can play in decarbonizing the aviation sector, if any. So this report was written, I think, last year at some point, and we did kind of a comprehensive literature review, which is what the report is based on. So we'll touch on the different bits and pieces that we've discussed in the reports and go to details around how we've kind of examined ammonia's viability, and then ended with a few pros and cons of ammonia as a fuel, and then we'll conclude the presentation. So just to set a little bit of the context as to why we're looking at this issue in the first place, and there are other researchers within Tyndall and elsewhere that are looking at aviation decarbonization in a lot more detail. And that's largely because it has over time taken up a larger and larger percentage of CO2, global CO2 emissions. And despite the drop recently due to COVID-19, we've seen that it's taken up 2% of global CO2 emissions in 2022. Although a lot of these projections around aviation emissions do determine that it's going to probably bounce back very quickly. So CO2 is, of course, one part of aviation emissions. There are a whole host of other non-CO2 emissions that are much harder to quantify, especially when they're at higher altitudes. And there are academic papers that say that if you really quantify the non-CO2 emissions, it actually doubles the warming impact it has. So any sort of future strategies or any transitions that include alternative fuels will have to consider non-CO2 emissions and its impacts, and we'll get into that in detail. So we also want to contextualize UK's aviation sector and where it stands at the moment. The international and domestic aviation emissions have been included now as part of the UK's net zero plans, and in this projection, there is expected to be a 45% decline if the UK aviation sector wants to be in line with net zero. And regardless of that happening, CCC and other emissions pathways have determined that there's going to be residual emissions from the aviation sector, partly because technological step change is really hard to come by within this particular sector. Because we're working towards a temperature target rather than a numerical one, it's important to consider what the cumulative emissions or historical emissions are and UK's role in that. So if you're really kind of trying to adhere to Paris compliant agreements, there's also research that's been done that says that UK actually needs to do a lot more if it really wants to be in line with Paris Agreement or Paris 1.5 temperature targets. And that is based on, common but differentiated responsibility principle, which has been mentioned in the agreement itself. And because of the residual emissions that I mentioned earlier and the expected residual emissions, there is an over-reliance on technological and natural CDR, so it's carbon capture and storage, and offsets are expected to meet or make up the rest of the emissions removals to kind of meet the net zero targets for the aviation sector. But of course, these are not, this is not unlimited. There's a combination and a whole host of measures that have been mentioned in various different plans to decarbonize aviation, and that is a combination, typically a combination of some kind of market-based mechanisms, carbon dioxide removal technology, energy efficiency technologies, fuel switching, which is what we're going to focus on in this presentation, technological innovation, and demand management. While we do acknowledge that there are many, many things that you can do to decarbonize the aviation sector, this particular presentation or report rather focused more on this fuel switching side of things. So before we kind of jump into why the viability of ammonia is important, I wanted to give sort of a brief presentation on what its uses at the moment. It is one of the, I think is the second largest chemical that's been produced in the world, and it is produced using a very carbon and energy intensive method called the Haber-Bosch, where you separate nitrogen from the air, you extract hydrogen from natural gas and water, and combine them or synthesize them with high heat and high pressure to form ammonia. It's very ubiquitous in different sectors at the moment, particularly as fertilizer in agriculture, used for refrigeration. It's also transported in different modes, which will play an important role in why we're kind of, discussing ammonia as a potential fuel for aviation. It's transported by rail, pipelines, and ships already. And aside from its existing demand from the agriculture and refrigeration sector, we also envision that maritime will take up a huge chunk of that future demand if green ammonia is one of the fuels that they want to use. And another indirect use of ammonia could be as a hydrogen carrier. So what the relevance of sort of the transition into green ammonia doesn't only happen one way. There's different ways that ammonia can play a role in aviation transition. And on the left-hand side, you've kind of listed the different ways in which ammonia can be potentially used. One, it can be used as a direct fuel itself. It can be combusted. Second, it can be blended with hydrogen. There are many kind of lab-based studies so far that have looked at the combination of ammonia and hydrogen and how that combusts and its flammability. Third, it could be used as a hydrogen carrier. And that's particularly relevant because of hydrogen's high flammability, but obviously it has low volumetric energy density. So that's where ammonia can play a bigger role. It's easier to transport and store, and we've been doing that for years. And its application in a fuel cell. And again, we'll discuss those when we're getting into more of the technical details about, ammonia's viability in a bit, but this has been taken up not just by us, and as Tim mentioned, it's being discussed in other parts of the UK, specifically companies like Reaction Engines and Zero Avia, who've pursued ammonia in different forms. I think there's another company called Aviation H2, which is not mentioned in the presentation, and they have gone for the hydrogen carrier route in planes, but it's only been tested in a very small charter flight so far. I think also to preface this presentation, there's a lot of information about ammonia itself, but very few in the context of aviation, partly because we don't have many use case examples of how ammonia, of its application in the real world. But because we have an existing know-how and we know how to handle it, we've been transporting it from one place to the other. We know its properties and are familiar enough with it, so we can store it and transport it easily, which is why it's being looked at. But like I said, the Haber-Bosch currently is carbon and energy intensive. I think it contributes to 1% of global CO2 emissions and also uses around 2% of global energy. And if there's a transition and concern, then ideally we would be pursuing the same route, hence why we're proposing a green ammonia route. So before we can also jump into kind of saying that it can be a potential aviation fuel, there are a number of operational and technical challenges that have to be met before it can be approved as a potential fuel. So we first look at some of the operational factors, and that includes more of the upstream production side, existing capacities, existing demand, and what that would mean if aviation demand is also added onto it. Unfortunately, the capacities currently of green ammonia are not nearly as enough as you would need to kind of meet current fertilizer demand from fertilizer industry, plus marine industry, plus aviation industry, and the potential capacity that is envisioned by 2030 is also not enough. Just to give an idea, I think UK domestic fuel use for aviation was around 50 million metric tons recently, and the plant capacity is just a drop in the bucket for the kind of demand we're talking about. Again, ammonia is a toxic chemical and it's corrosive. While we do have an idea of what its application would be in the fertilizer industry, when we're talking about adapting it into the aviation industry, there's lots of different things that we need to consider. And particularly being an inland application, if you're going to store it in an airport, what do the containment zones look like in case there is an accident? And those safety concerns actually are a huge priority for the aviation sector. It is also, at the moment, does not make much business sense to produce it domestically in the UK. And there are various studies, and we're gonna also discuss this in detail when we're talking about the economics of green ammonia production. It actually makes more sense now to produce it in a low-cost country and then transport it, because transporting it is much cheaper than producing it domestically in the UK at least. Again, the technical metrics of aviation of ammonia as a fuel are quite important, particularly its ability to reignite during cruise. So when there is obviously a set of technical metrics that the CAA uses to essentially judge a potential new fuel, and that will apply for hydrogen, SAF, and other alternatives for aviation, and that includes ammonia. Of course, on the right, there's a table that kind of looks at, there's a great study by Otto, and they've actually looked at ammonia in detail in the context of aviation. One of the very few studies that has actually done this. And a lot of what's mentioned here has also been mentioned by other stakeholders in the industry, where we need to kind of think about the practical implications of using ammonia. What do the refueling times look like in the airports? How far can an ammonia fuel aircraft take us? And what are the midstream and infrastructural changes that need to be implemented, and how, and of course, at the end of the day, it's also about scale. We are not just doing this in the UK. If we're talking about a global market, it's much, much bigger than a lab base or a charter flight. Right, so these are some of the technical factors, and here's where I suppose ammonia kind of scores better than some of the other, I suppose, hydrogen, which is what it's compared to. It can be stored. It doesn't need to be stored in cryogenic temperatures. It is easy to store. Its volumetric energy density is much higher. It has more hydrogen than hydrogen itself, which is why it's typically brought up as a, why it should be a hydrogen carrier. That's a kind of a good pro for ammonia, I suppose. And also currently, a lot of the life cycle assessment studies show that if we pursue the green ammonia and green hydrogen route, it is actually 80%. There is 80% less CO2 grams of CO2 that is emitted from well to wake when you compare it with Jet A1. But currently, conventional ways of producing ammonia and hydrogen are not carbon efficient, so they're much worse than producing Jet A1. So I think if you're talking about a transition, I think when we're talking about a transition, we need to consider production and the way that it's produced rather than only just kind of focusing on the combustion part of it. Fuel composition matters in jet fuel, and there's been a lot of studies that have kind of looked at the different blends of ammonia and hydrogen and what will perform the best against the metrics that are existent. There's also a potential that because hydrogen and ammonia don't behave the way Jet A1 does, it could be that criteria could be changed for certain things. But again, like I said, safety is important. And fuel composition also feeds into the next point here, which is around N2O and NOx emissions. So depending on how much fuel and the blends that go into the aviation fuel, N2O emissions and NOx emissions can be reduced or they'll be higher. But because it's so hard to quantify N2O emissions and NOx emissions at higher altitude, and we're not just talking about this at a combustion level, again, we're producing it as well. Fuel cell or non-combustion options also come into play. But there's many issues with fuel cells. First, we don't really know much about it in the aviation application, the context of aviation particularly. Even though it will be N2O free and NOx free, it has a relatively low TRL. And one of the other important things when aviation is concerned is weight, and fuel cells need to meet weight requirements in order to be viable as an option. So here are some of the economic factors, and we have to kind of pay attention to the business case that ammonia provides as a potential aviation fuel, and that's because fuel makes up 70% of the direct operating costs for certain types of aircrafts, and so the business case for it cannot be ignored, because it is different, because currently green ammonia is not produced at scale. It's particularly difficult to determine what the capital cost or capital expenditure of it is going to be, and it definitely depends on where it's produced. So currently, like I mentioned, it will be much cheaper to produce it somewhere where solar energy is cheaper. Say Chile or Morocco, those are the countries that are often named as green ammonia producers, and then ship it to countries where there is a demand. But because we again talk about scale, if this is a route that, you know, other sectors pursue, including maritime or the fertilizer industry, over time costs will reduce due to maturing technology. And we also determined that carbon price can improve the operational expenditure of green ammonia. It can subsidize it heavily, depending on you know, your ETS and how strong your emission trading system is. So what does policy need to consider? There's various conversations around decarbonization of aviation, particularly. It comes at a tricky time because we're now in this post-COVID era where aviation is trying to kind of recover as a sector from the last few years. And so having a conversation around decarbonization and investments into decarbonization in the scale that is required is quite a big and a difficult conversation to have at times. And so that is particularly harder, but again, we're talking about an infrastructure expansion. So it's not just that we produce green ammonia at scale. What are airports going to look like if we are storing, I'd say, hydrogen or ammonia on site? Safety and regulatory issues that needs to be addressed and set up for alternative fuels that don't behave like Jet A1, and what implications it has as a result. And again, public perception is quite an important one here. When we're talking about ammonia, it is toxic, it can be deadly if there is leakage, and public perception can definitely sway or influence policy around this type of fuel. So here are some of the pros and cons that we have discussed already. Some of the pros kind of are around the safety issue, and this is a particularly tricky one because, like I said, even though there is an existing know-how around green ammonia, because we use it in the fertilizer industry, there's no guarantee that, you know, its applicability in aviation will be the same. There's different safety concerns and requirements, and that could definitely change. But it's not a foreign substance that we haven't handled before. There's different ways that you can also apply ammonia in aviation, so it doesn't necessarily have to be used as a fuel directly because it has very low flammability, so its properties are very different. So you can crack it back to hydrogen and use hydrogen as a fuel, and that way you get the benefits of transporting and using and storing ammonia as ammonia, but using hydrogen as a fuel because of its higher energy density. And then applying it in a fuel cell. Again, there's a lot of research that needs to be done. There's existing research already, but a lot more needs to be understood around fuel cells in the context of aviation to comfortably say that ammonia can be used. It can be stored and transported easily because of its physical properties, and it is CO2 free. Some of the cons, we spoke a little bit about the capacity constraints currently. And if you're talking about this big scale demands from different sectors, current capacity for green ammonia or green hydrogen will not meet those demands. Non-CO2 emissions are fairly important. I think first to kind of quantify and what they look like in an aviation setting. Second is to understand how we can address this, because any transition needs to consider, and if not, then transitioning into a non-CO2 pathway can completely offset if we still have non-CO2 emissions. Infrastructural changes are required midstream. I think in practice, there needs to be so many changes where it's being produced, how it's going to be transported from point A to point B. Pipelines need to be set up, storage in airports, refueling infrastructure. All of these need to be changed in airports, including regulation that comes with it. And like I've just said, public perception can carry a lot of weight, and this is particularly tricky for aviation as it is a consumer-facing sector. So just to conclude, like we said, ammonia could play a role in aviation's future, perhaps not as a fuel in itself, because there's lots more that we need to understand about it, but it definitely has a role to play as a carrier for hydrogen. More development and testing are needed to establish ammonia and ammonia blends as fuels, and whether they're suitable to be used in aviation. Costs and capacities of ammonia hydrogen remain unclear. There's different future forecasts around capacities that are needed for green ammonia, particularly green hydrogen, as hydrogen has kind of taken a more central role. However, they remain unclear as to if you had to add the demand from aviation, what that would look like. Non-CO2 emissions should be carefully considered before jumping into something like using ammonia as a fuel for aviation. And because technological solutions are not on track to kind of deliver the scale of decarbonization required by Paris agreements, and we kind of talked about this in terms of this UK net zero as well, something that UK net zero does not align. In cases like that, demand management strategies are crucial to kind of achieve these meaningful reductions. I think that's all I have. The report is officially online. People can kind of scan the QR code on this slide if they want to have a quick read of the report. Over to you, Tim.
That's great. Thank you so much, Asha. If you want to stop sharing your screen,
Yeah, I'll do that.
don't worry for people that didn't have time to press the QR code. It will reappear later before the end of the call. So we will come back to that. So let me just move us on to the Q&A. As I said, please, if you want to put a question to Asha or Chris or Alice, please type it into the box, and we will take it from there. We will introduce them for you. I'm about to introduce Chris and Alice, who are going to join Asha. Alice, I should say, I can see that you're on the call. You're on my attendee list and not on the panelist list. So, sorry to do this sort of live, as it were, but if you log off, there is an email for you with a panelist link, and it will bring you back in, and that means that you can speak and take the floor. So I'll give you a moment or two to do that. So, as I said at the beginning, our thanks go to Tyndall Centre for this work. I think it gave us so much to think about. We've got lots of questions, and I'm sure you have questions too. And so the next Q&A session is an opportunity to explore that. So Asha is being joined by Chris. Chris Jones is a research fellow at the Tyndall Centre. He has an interest in life cycle assessment, energy storage, and sort of energy scenarios. His work at the Tyndall Centre is focused on transferring research from the group's sort of scientific and technical work, and exploring how to put that into sort of policy, industry, and sort of community applications. And he's been working directly with Manchester City Council on its climate change policy framework. And then Alice, who will join us very shortly. Alice, we've known for a very long time. She's a very authoritative voice in this scenario. She's professor in climate change and energy policy at the Tyndall Centre. And Alice has a broad research interest revolving around energy systems and transition to a low carbon economy. In addition, a focus on emission budgets for decarbonisation, and her core research has been on international transportation, specifically on aviation and shipping, and we're really pleased that she's joining the panel as well. So I'm going to, just for the moment, take us off screen share so I can see the Q&A box. We've got several questions that are already coming in. So the first one I'm going to put to you, Asher and Chris, is from Aoife O'Leary at Opportunity Green. And Aoife asks, what do we need in order to fully understand what the N2O emissions are? Is it test flights? Is it other research? How do we go about obtaining this information?
Yes, I think N2 emissions are tricky. They're very hard to quantify. I think so far there have been very kind of preliminary research on N2O and its potential implications. The issue here is that there's no kind of certainty around conversion of nitrogen into N2O when it reacts with air. But I think there was a paper that said that even 0.4% of that conversion will actually just offset any kind of change that you or transition that you've made from a CO2 to a non-CO2 to fuel. So it's a very small percentage of change that's required to kind of offset that because N2O is much more potent than CO2. But yes, I mean, I can't really answer this because I'm not sort of a climate scientist. You know, N2O emissions and non-CO2 emissions are particularly difficult to understand because first, there's very limited research on it, but yes, do you have
I think the other main variable is understanding how much nitrogen is leaked during the process. So it's everything from the production of the fuel, the transport, storage, and then into the use phase. And certainly the papers we've looked at that have sort of raised this issue as something to look at have only had estimates to work with about how much the fraction of nitrogen that's getting out from the fuel into the air and then reacting. So there's a couple of uncertainties there.
Thanks, Chris. Alice, I didn't know whether you can unmute. Sorry about the technical difficulties in getting you across as a presenter, but you may have opportunity to join now. There was a question you may not have heard the response from Asha and from Chris, but there was a question related to how do we better understand the sort of N2O emissions side of things? Is it test flights? And I think from sort of Asha's point of view, I mean, I think we got a good answer about the work that needs to be done, but whether there's a sort of an atmospheric science response to that, you may want to come in. Don't feel obliged because you missed the discussion, but the floor's yours.
No, apologies. It's my technical ineptitude that's at play this morning. No, I mean, I think it's just, I mean, this is coming out in some work that we've been doing on shipping as well. I think it is just to be mindful of the potential risk for these other types of emissions that might be not saying that they're underplayed at the moment, but they're nowhere near as well understood, and they just tend to not get the attention. In aviation, it's always been a little bit different, that there has been more attention to the non-CO2 aspects of the problem, and it's not just CO2. But I think that one of the things that appears to be concerning is that in some of the models that are used to sort of, you know, life cycle assessments and other things that are typically used, are kind of using a lot of assumptions on the fact that these N2O emissions, for example, could be managed one way or another when there's combustion, and that might be, you know, by using additional technology that is put onto you know, an engine, ship's engine, or an aircraft engine, and so on. But of course, there are energy penalties to any additional things that you have to put on sort of after the fact in order to prevent something, you know, being emitted. And I think it's just being mindful of the fact that this is not well understood at this stage, and so more work, as Asha will have been saying, needs to be done to understand that, so that we're not just, you know, looking for a solution to one thing and creating a problem to an, you know, that we need to then solve, which is it's not just about in aviation, you know, there's the non-CO2 emissions that create warming that are non-greenhouse gas based, but if it's N2O emissions, then that is also another long-lived greenhouse gas, and that is the big concern here, is that we just need to make sure that that's well understood.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Mike Mason, the Green Ammonia Working Group at Oxford. So I'm going to read this one out. So apologies if it sounds clunky, but have the team considered the constraints on hydrogen or carbon-based fuels? Hydrogen cannot be transported as a liquid, but needs to be used as a liquid. So to meet the needs of Heathrow alone would require sort of 2.7 gigawatts just for cooling. And obviously, we also need to get rid of the 3 gigawatts of heat that it generates. So carbon's problematic. Where will it come from in a zero carbon world? We will need sorry, I need my glasses to read the rest of this question. We will need 5 gigatons a year of carbon capture for polymers alone, and probably another 10 gigatons of CO2 a year to bury to hold the climate stable. So this requires 1 million tons of air per second to be mechanically handled and chemically treated. And adding to this burden is unlikely to be allowed. So I think the question really is about, yes, there are perhaps constraints around ammonia, but that's also true for sort of hydrogen, other carbon-based fuels. So thoughts on that question. Apologies for reading it out in full, but I thought it was easier than trying to summarize with all the numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's correct. I mean, even though we haven't considered hydrogen, because this was a study particularly on ammonia, and there's a lot of great existing studies on hydrogen. I think you can't not kind of think about it, because hydrogen is probably going to use 90% of the energy in ammonia production. That is the main component. It probably will end up using the highest energy. And I know there's a question by somebody else around this hydrogen ammonia as well. But yes, I think it's particularly, I think where ammonia comes in, and I think we discussed this around as its role as a hydrogen carrier, will kind of play into this, because it doesn't need to be cryo-cooled. So perhaps energy requirements in airports will be much lower in that scenario. And even in marine applications, it's been discussed as a potential carrier. But it has a much higher TRL because ammonia has been proven to be able to kind of work in dual fuel engines and shipping applications. But this is more sort of in practical terms, if ammonia itself cannot be used as a fuel because it doesn't burn very well, it doesn't ignite very well, and you can't have that in a plane. And hydrogen can. So what is the combination that we need to figure out in order to, in practice, make sure that we're using ammonia for its pros, but also hydrogen for its pros? I can't really sort of speak too much into the carbon-based fuels as much there, but yeah.
Thanks, Sasha. And then I'll just take Mike's sort of follow up, and I'll take this as a comment, but he also makes the point that as the capacity for green ammonia is fundamentally constrained by hydrogen production, the challenges for ammonia and hydrogen are the same. So I'll take that as a statement. I'm going to turn to a question from Sally Cairns, who is an independent researcher and academic. Sally asked that, firstly, thank you for a really interesting presentation, but a question is shipping relying on a major increase in using ammonia to decarbonize? And if so, will this mean that supply issues would be even more challenging if aviation did try to use this more?
Yes, and I think we kind of discussed the different sectors that will use ammonia directly, and shipping is not on top of the list. Fertilizer industry is. And if you're looking to decarbonize or produce green ammonia, they'll be the first recipients of that. And one of the big advantages that the fertilizer industry has is that 90% of the ammonia that they produce on site, they use on site. So they don't have issues around transport and storage, particularly that marine applications and aviation applications will have, because you can't be producing green ammonia in an airport. So yes, I think it will definitely add to the demand, and a lot of reports don't consider aviation on the list of direct use for ammonia in the future, although shipping does kind of come in there. But yes, I think Alice wants to say something.
Yeah, Alice, please come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's an interesting debate going on in the shipping industry at the moment. There's one side is sort of saying we just need to know what the liquid fuel is going to be of the future, and another side saying it's likely to be a portfolio of measures like it is in all of the sectors. If you're actually committed to something like the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement, that kind of transition is going to require multiple different solutions. and then you might find in the shipping sector that there's quite a lot of people who are considering that ammonia is the most likely option, particularly people who are looking for kind of one solution. But again, we've done some other work looking at the different demand for ammonia and therefore hydrogen, as the point was being made. You're talking about the same supply chain there, and the capacity that would be required for shipping is also very large. As Asha says, there's the demand in the fertilizer industry is already huge, assuming that wants to go down a green route as well. And many of the production plants for hydrogen, although there's lots of plans, they're kind of quite nascent, and so the gap between what is currently being produced and or even what is planned to be produced within a decade and what would actually be needed for different sectors, there's a huge gap between those things. So the more sectors that demand and are assuming that these fuels are going to be available, the bigger that gap is, if you like, between what's going to be practically achievable and what's available, or at least is being invested in, even if it's technically feasible. There needs to be kind of the money into the supply chain to start to produce these fuels. And so I think there are big questions around, where is the most appropriate use for quite specialized fuels, particularly for sectors that have fewer options. And I think that's when you come back to the interesting questions around aviation, is that it is one of the sectors that has fewer options for its decarbonisation in the kind of time frame we're talking about. Whereas in shipping, I would argue that there are a number of other options and other opportunities that the shipping sector could take up, whereas aviation is much more limited. So in that sort of framing, you might look for solutions like hydrogen, like ammonia for aviation, and look for other things that are more viable for shipping. And there's more variety in shipping anyway. So, for example, short sea shipping could take more advantage of electricity, battery electric, wind propulsion, route optimization, that kind of thing. Whereas, in aviation, it's much more challenging to think about what the other solutions could be other than some sort of liquid fuel or ultimately fuel cell if we could get the power requirements.
Thanks both. So I don't know who the next question's from, but also congratulating you, Asha, on the presentation. But the question is, do you have thoughts on the total energy requirements for e-fuels versus green ammonia? They would guess that nitrogen is probably easier to extract from the air than carbon is, and therefore maybe easier to combine with hydrogen. That's the question.
I don't have the number on top of my head about the energy requirement question, but again, the bit that was going to probably take up the larger share of the energy requirement is the green hydrogen production, and nitrogen extraction from air will stay the same as it is with conventional ammonia production at the moment. So the electrolysis bit is the one that's going to be the most energy intensive. So I don't really know the combination of sort of carbon with hydrogen, but on the ammonia question, perhaps, yeah, electrolysis will probably still kind of use the highest energy. Don't know if I understand the second bit of the question, to be honest.
Well, we'll take that away and maybe think about how we can respond by email, Asha. I'm jumping around the questions a little bit. I haven't forgotten the people who have asked questions and I'm not necessarily doing them in order. I'll ask them all, but I wanted to jump to a question from James Beard from European Climate Foundation, largely because it built on the last discussion about the uses of ammonia and sort of differences between aviation and shipping. So James also says, great presentation discussion. Interested to hear the panelists' views on the discussion around ammonia and why it's so different between aviation and maritime. So is it because largely for technical reasons? Is it perception issues? Maritime being less consumer facing than aviation, or other factors? But we hear a lot about it in one sector, not so much in others. So yeah, interested in thoughts.
Yes, I think it is a combination of things that James mentioned there. I think it is technical, partly because you can use ammonia as a fuel in dual fuel engines at the moment. So it's ready to be used. Whether the shipping industry is using it or not is a different question, but you know, the technological readiness of ammonia in shipping is much higher than it is with aviation. And yes, I think certification around aviation fuels is particularly difficult because you're talking about safety. And like we mentioned in the presentation, I think one of the crucial kind of assessments that the CAA does before they kind of approve a particular fuel is to see whether it can reignite in cruise. And I mean, it takes years. You know, we can kind of talk about SAF and how long it took for that to get approved, and you know, all the certification that it has to go through. And that is a drop in fuel. So when we're talking about ammonia, it has a lot of different properties. Again, I think it does also have to do with the consumer facing bit of it, because and there's been great studies by different academics. I think Stefan Gosling has done work around consumer perceptions of flying in a plane that's powered by biofuels, and what people think about, you know, doing that, and whether there's they think that it's dangerous. I think you've seen a particular infrastructure, and you've seen the same kind of infrastructure. You fly on the same plane, and we've seen it for years and years. If that's different tomorrow, what is the public perception that comes with it? And are people going to feel safe flying on a plane that looks different than it has been for the last, you know, how many ever years? So yeah, it is. I think it's a combination of things. I think it's both to do with kind of upstream issues, sort of like its technical viability, but also downstream issues like public perception. Yeah. You want to add something?
I think there's also, so I think one of the attendees made a good point as well about shipping energy products as a major part of shipping anyway. So I think again, the shipping industry's been quite alive to the idea of that transition, what that would mean for its business, and whether products like ammonia or even hydrogen in some forms shipped and biofuels could replace oil and coal as bulk fuels transported globally. So I think there's a kind of more of a commercial interest in these fuels that maybe there isn't in aviation, and maybe that's also driven some interest in looking at ammonia and it shipping, as I understand it. Like if it ships oil, we'd also prefer to use that as bunkering fuel as well. So there's a bit more synergy there, and maybe that's started the process of thinking about this at an earlier stage than is the case for aviation.
Yeah, thanks both. And I think you were referring partly to the fact that Mike had typed into the chat to note that 40% of world shipping is actually used for the transport of fossil fuels. So I think that you alluded to that in your response. And just to cover off one other thing, Mike, I'm going to put you down as the ammonia enthusiast in all of this, and sort of highlighting the challenges that other pathways face as well. And so I think you have responded partly to the question about the comparison with e-fuels, and you say every atom of carbon, CO2 converted to SAF requires 6.2 atoms of hydrogen. So 2/3 of that has to go to making expensive water to remove the CO2. So again, I'll take those two as comments. I'm going to go to a question from Alexander Kunkel from Transport and Environment. So this is around sort of non-CO2 impacts. So are there assessments of the non-CO2 effects through contrail formation?
Alice, I might ask you to maybe come in here. You're the non-CO2.
I think we've also got Sally, who's on the webinar as an expert on this more than I am. I mean, routinely there are kind of updated assessments on the non-CO2 impacts on from aviation, and the contrail. So there's some of these non-CO2 emissions. So for example, soot and water vapor create contrails, so the condensation trails out the back of the aircraft. And one of the big uncertainties is that sometimes those contrails can then go on to produce cirrus clouds, so very high cloud. Both of those things in the end create a warming impact that is in addition to the impact of the CO2 from aircraft. I'm not right up to speed with whether or not there's been a very recent study on this, and I'm sure Sally might be able to put something in the chat there. I know she's done a really good review of the non-CO2 emissions and a report that she'll probably hopefully put in the chat there. I can't see whether that could get posted in some way after this. But that covers this in a really nice way as to what the latest understanding is. But from the atmospheric science point of view, the tricky element is actually how do you assess whether a cirrus cloud is a cirrus cloud because it would have naturally formed because of the humidity and the particular conditions, or whether it's been triggered by a contrail, and therein there is a really big uncertainty. And I suspect, not having looked at the literature just in the last year or so, but that remains quite a large uncertainty, and the tendency is that it's likely that it will underestimate the amount of warming from the non-CO2 stuff, from that contrail production. But again, the other point I suppose to say on the other side of it is that contrails are very short-lived and also very localized. So unlike greenhouse gases, which is why there's so much more focus typically on greenhouse gases, is they're long-lived and they become well mixed in the atmosphere, and therefore it's harder to get rid of the warming once they're there. Whereas if you ground an aircraft, then it's not going to produce, or the contrail will dissipate within a matter of hours. So quite different problems, but yeah, still a lot of uncertainty. But hopefully, maybe Sally, we could produce something or get something together after this and update people on what the latest thinking is.
Thanks, Alice, and yes, Sally, if you're able to drop a link into your work, that'll be helpful for others to view. I'm going to ask Kate Hewitt, who's AF's policy director, and oversaw this sort of work with Tyndall Centre, whether, Kate, you have questions that have come out of this. I think we found it like a really fascinating work, but I wonder if you had sort of key questions and that you wanted to highlight.
Wow, thank you. I think there are lots of questions we could take away. I suppose one of the big issues in my mind, aside from all the sort of technical challenges and just the sort of feasibility of doing any of this stuff kind of quick enough to make this to meet the scale of the challenge, is just I guess how, and I think you touched on this, Alice, as well, but how the sort of demand from aviation might sit aside alongside that from other sectors of the economy. So I guess the more that we look at this challenge, the clearer it is that there are no perfect solutions, put it that way, for decarbonising aviation. Every option comes with really significant challenges. So we've done a lot of work around sort of liquid alternative fuels, so-called sustainable aviation fuels. We're quite skeptical about those increasingly playing a big part. Hydrogen aircraft obviously come with their own challenges. Electric aircraft, I don't think anyone thinks they're going to be able to cover long routes in the time frame. So you think, yeah, well, look, perhaps we just need to do something about aviation demand. But even if you do that, you can't hit the challenge of actually getting the sector's emissions down to nothing unless you do address some of these really difficult sort of technology fuels issues as well. So whereas I suppose if you were to take from one perspective a view of the whole economy and say, well, where is ammonia easy, or green ammonia easiest to deploy? Where does it have even like the most social utility or something? Then aviation wouldn't even get a look in. Whereas if you say, yeah, but we really want to keep flying as a society, but there are no good answers here, does that then shift the scales potentially and start to make something like ammonia make sense? So I suppose that's the question. There may not be an answer to that here, but if any of you as panelists, I guess, have a view on that, that might be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's kind of tricky to answer for many reasons. One is because when we're looking at the fuel switching part of the debate, our focus kind of isn't on the demand side, although of course kind of we identified that there's many steps that you can take. I think what has been noticeable is that this kind of over-reliance on technological and natural removals, CO2 removals for aviation pathways. And I think the closer we're getting to the 2050 target, the more we see that, you know, ETS and CORSIA and other market-based mechanisms are taking up a larger role, including CCS. And there's also an issue of priority when it comes to those sectors. Where should we use CCS where it's used the most? For example, cement. Cement as an industry cannot be produced without CO2. And so when we talk about in the CCS conversation, there's often this, you know, that we need CCS for cement. Do we need CCS for aviation as well? But in that case, aviation is not a need, it's a want. People do it because they need it. But, you know, so there's arguments for and against that. So yeah, I think there's already an existing over-reliance on CDR technologies, and of course with CORSIA and all of the kind of controversies around natural offsets, it's particularly difficult to kind of say like which direction aviation is going to. But I don't know if Chris and Alice have a different opinion or point of view on this.
Alice, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been the most difficult sector to consider what the options should be. And although there aren't as many different avenues, I think, I mean, demand management has to be a part of this. I think one of the things that sometimes we don't talk about is that, you know, how long would you need to do the demand management for? Because if we're talking about a framing where we are trying to be successful with, you know, the Paris Agreement, then you're actually talking about sorting through this issue over the next couple of decades. I mean, it's a really short-term issue, as well as, you know, keeping us on the right track. So some of the technology solutions, you know, may well come on stream later on. In the meantime, you still need to do something. So it's like, what are the measures that you need to do in the near term in order that you don't blow the budget and make it even harder in the longer term? And so I think that demand management, although it's not something that is currently particularly an area that is getting a lot of discussion and debate, I think it has to be part of the mix if we are to be successful for aviation in the short to medium term. But it doesn't mean you have to do that forever, because if you can get the technologies right later on, and you can actually get you know, a very low carbon way of flying, then you know that sort of resolves that issue. But that's going to be quite a long time down the line. So it's like, are we needing to talk about, you know, temporary demand management in areas that are you know, where there's lots of frequent flying? And of course there's the big inequity question, that who's flying, you know, what are the alternatives for the people who are doing the frequent flying, and also this sort of tricky issue around, you know, need and want, as Asha mentioned. You know, when you compare aviation and shipping, for example, and you're talking about global trade, and you're talking about, you know, food supply chains and resource supply chains, that's quite a different issue to some of the things that people are using aviation for. That's really tricky, but, you know, it is a debate that needs to be had, because otherwise we're not going to resolve this. You know, the timeframes are just too long for some of the technological solutions in aviation.
Okay, thanks to all our panelists. We're on the hour, so I am going to wrap up. I'm going to direct you quickly to the chat. So Sally's posted a link to her work on CO2 effects. And I think a final comment from Mike, just to have regard to the bigger system when it comes to ammonia, not just looking at aviation in isolation. Think about the changes that agriculture is going to go through, and how supply demand changes in the future. So I'm going to end the Q&A there. Let me just finally share my screen one final time, and I will just give the briefest of sort of concluding remarks. So first of all, you know, a big thank you to Asha and to Chris and to Alice as well, for not just for the report, but for taking the time to present it today. You showed a QR code, Asha, earlier, where people could download the report. The link is back up on the screen now. It will also be sent to everyone as a follow-up. We'll also be sending out the recording of the presentation. We've actually got a sort of competing meeting this morning that has taken the attention of a lot of people that would be interested in this topic and who want to see it. So, you know, as I said up front, we want to send this out. I think from AEF's point of view, I think what we've taken from this exercise is, or taken away from it, is certainly the feeling that ammonia could have a role to play in decarbonising aviation, and it certainly has some advantages compared with hydrogen in terms of ease of transport and storage. I think we've noted that the production rate for green ammonia, which is obviously the direction we need to be heading in, is currently low, and as with hydrogen, there will be competing uses. There's a ramp up of green ammonia supply would be required to avoid diverting this from other current applications. But then I think in the discussion that we've had, you know, an invitation to think ahead a little bit about how that may change in the future, that supply and demand across different sectors may actually be fluctuating. So need to take that into account. Further research and testing would be required before ammonia could be considered a serious component of the aviation decarbonisation pathway, especially in relation to slippage and leakage issues. And they could substantially undermine the climate benefit if we don't treat them properly. And it's unlikely, obviously, that ammonia is even going to enter the policy mix in the absence of any sort of specific intervention and policy action. So plenty of us to think about and take away. I hope it's given you plenty of thought too. I'm going to wrap up the session now and say thank you all for attending, and a big thank you to Asha, Chris, and Alice, and the Tyndall team for both the work and their time today. Thanks everyone for joining us. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.